stakes of masking autism is way higher in my experience than ADHD. I can get away with being a bit overzealous and overenthusiastic in a conversation and interrupting, or, being forgetful, being disorganized. I can get away with that without really bad things happening. Whereas openly stimming, you can't get away with that.
Peter Wharmby is a best-selling author and AuDHD specialist.
An award-winning expert in the field.
He's on a mission to raise awareness
for the struggles experienced by those with ADHD and autism.
Autism and ADHD are perhaps two sides of the same coin. So we know they're related, but we don't know exactly how. Now, it might be that monotropism is the coin. Non-autistic, neurotypical people are polytropic. They can pay attention to multiple things at once without any real hassle, whereas monotropic people, like autistic people, have a tendency or are wired to pay attention to one thing at a time at great depth.
Do you think there's a risk that problem-solving ability of people with AuDHD could make them vulnerable when they're depressed?
Part of you is always compromising in a way that it really doesn't want to.
Loyal listeners and viewers, I can't thank you enough for tuning in to ADHD Chatter, where we ask world-leading ADHD experts the hard questions to give you access to the most cutting-edge information on the topic. If you've ever felt broken or different, I hope this helps in your search for information, answers, and community. And do you know what would really help me in return? By clicking the follow or subscribe button wherever you're listening. It might not seem like much, but at ADHD Chatter, it means a huge deal. And with this, I can book more incredible guests and keep the self-discovery fire alive for all of us, including myself. Just one click of a button goes a lot further than you think. We'll promise to listen to your feedback and book the guests you want on topics that matter to you. And remember, you're not broken, just different, and you have always been enough. Pete, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Welcome to the ADHD Chatter Studio. Thank you so much for making the trip down.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's a very colourful and cheerful space, which makes me very happy, actually. It's really nice.
All of the previous guests' items are on display behind us, and I'm excited to unravel and reveal yours later on.
Yes.
But first, Pete, just to set the foundation for the episode, what is your mission in the world of neurodiversity?
It's always been the same, really, ever since I was diagnosed and I found the community online and realised just how many of us were struggling. I'm autistic and ADHD, and many people I know are as well. And, the rates of depression, anxiety, unemployment, not that employment is the be-all and end-all, but it does help. All those kind of things, suicidality, I don't want to get too heavy too quickly, but they're all really high, but, and they have been for a very long time. We've been let down, I think, as a population, generally speaking. And so I kind of, as a teacher, I got it into my head that what I wanted to do was to get people to understand that this existed. That people share a world with people who have brains that work in a really different way, but who the world is not calibrated for at all. Everything in the world that we see, society and structures and systems, they're all calibrated for this very particular type of brain. And if you don't fit in with that, then you're going to find it really hard. So I took it upon myself, I guess, over a period of about 5 years or so, to just try and get that information out there. Just like a voice kind of barking into the world, please listen, there are so many different types of brain and we need your help. So, ever since then, I, social media, started on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and written a couple of books, and I do talks and speeches at people these days. And it's all there, my mission to just try and get this information out there. Because I guess I fundamentally, naively believe that people, if they knew about this, would want to help, hopefully. And so I naively kind of hope that if I tell people this, then they'll be like, oh, okay, and just amend things slightly or change things a bit. So yeah, that's it really.
It's fascinating. You said you don't want to get too deep too fast, and you mentioned suicide, but I think I speak to people in the community who have sometimes ADHD, sometimes autism, a lot of the time both. They're AuDHD, and even though they don't
go as far as to saying or broaching that topic, you can sense this sadness within them.
Yes,
you can see through the mask. You can see the hopelessness sometimes in their eyes. What do you think is the connection between feeling different and having potentially intrusive thoughts like that?
I think it's cumulative. I think that when you're neurodivergent generally, I mean, we'll focus on autism and ADHD here, of course, but I think from a very, very, very early age, you recognize how different you are. Or for different, you realize how little you fit in with the majority. You feel alien, you feel other. We know this because we know that autistic people, for example, start masking very early on. Nursery school, early primary school, 5, 6 years old. I mean, that in itself makes my skin crawl, that we are forced to pretend to be normal, from when you should just be able to just do what you like. You should, as a 6-year-old, you should just be able to explore the world in your own way. But instead, they're feeling this pressure to conform in a way that is extremely tiring, extremely exhausting, debilitating. And I think cumulatively, as years and years go by of experiencing that, along with the other things that come with being othered, bullying, being misunderstood, being misinterpreted, being misrepresented, by people around you, it just builds up and builds up and builds up, and you feel hopeless. Like, I'm going to have to expend enormous amounts of energy. I think, we kind of think to ourselves, perhaps, every day of my life, and it's always going to be this difficult. And I'm only like 12, or I'm only 19, or I'm only 32, or whatever. And oh God, like, oh no,
more of the same.
This is going to be rough. This is going to be really hard. And that naturally leads to at least intrusive thoughts, if not, unfortunately, worse.
Depression, is that a feeling that is connected to our inner self, our inner child? And we're very good at hiding that inner self and putting on a smile, putting on a mask, presenting ourselves in a particular way, looking happy, being a chameleon, pretending to be.
Oh, yes.
Do you think if you are someone who has been forced to mask from a young age because you feel different and othered, you will therefore struggle to articulate deep feelings of insecurity and depression when you're older?
I think so, yeah. You're already a master at masking, if you're autistic, for example, by the time you're a teenager. So finding yourselves now having to mask depression, which we all do as well, because depression, of course, is taboo. We're not allowed to talk about it. It's not okay. If somebody says, "Oh, how are you doing?" You can't say, "Well, actually, I'm really depressed," because you get looked at. You'd be struck off the list of Christmas cards, wouldn't you? Nobody would want to talk to you. So we are primed really to be able to mask that stuff too, and mask it very well. I mean, I remember I went to the doctors a couple of years back when I was really low. This was before, I think it was before my diagnosis. So I'm kind of looking back retrospectively now. And I went there because I was deeply depressed. I was really scared, and I wanted help. I wanted the doctor to take it seriously. It's always a bit of a battle, And I remember vividly, I walked into the surgery and the doctor was like, "Oh, hi, Mr. Wharmby, how are you?" And I just said, "Oh, I'm fine, thanks.
Yes,
how are you?"
Like a knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah, I went into my script. I mean, we were talking about scripts before the show, weren't we? And, I just went into my standard small talk script, and that completely scuppered the whole appointment, because immediately the doctor was, I don't know, he seems fine, it's a cheerful demeanor, kind of thing. And yeah, you hide it. You even from yourself, you don't even realize you're hiding it until it gets really bad, until too late, perhaps.
I see stories of people taking their own life, and you see images of them literally the day before sometimes. It's the family member saying he was so happy.
Yes.
We didn't see it coming. I think Chester, the lead singer of
Chester
Linkin
Bennington.
Park, there's a picture of him the day before he took his life,
yeah.
and he's at a dinner table laughing, looking like he's the happiest person in the world, surrounded by his family. But obviously inside he was in tormented.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a haunting picture I think. I mean, it was a shock. It was the same with Robin Williams. Obviously, with Williams, we found out there were health issues underlying it, weren't there, with the Lewy body issue that he had. But again, this larger than life person that always seemed to exude joy, and then one day gone. And I mentioned earlier when I went online when I was first diagnosed and discovered the community, that was kind of what I discovered. I mean, well, I didn't discover it. It wasn't like it wasn't known, but I found it out for myself that there are so many neurodivergent people out there who really are hurting a great deal. It's very difficult.
Focusing on your own personal story, Pete, do you have any early memories of feeling different?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I masked from a very early age, I think, looking back. I always felt like, there's a few bits to it, really. I never felt like I knew what was going on, if that makes sense.
Yes, it totally does.
Yeah, I never, I'm not a foolish person, I don't think. I'm relatively quick and, quick on the uptake. And if somebody is clear with me, I will understand the deal pretty swiftly, But for some reason, all the way through school and even in work as an adult, when I had a normal job, I would so often find myself feeling like I had no idea what was going on. What am I meant to do? Where am I meant to go? I don't know what to do. The anxiety would build. I never felt like I had a full grasp of what the people around me were doing, what they were going to do, how they worked. People were very confusing to me, even as a very young child. I found them very unpredictable and quite scary. Children and adults. Teachers who would just snap suddenly and be really angry, and what's going on? And kids who would, they'd be your best friend one minute, and then the next minute, deepest enemies. And I don't know what's happening here. So I never felt like I had the rule book for the social world that everyone else seemed to have kind of ingrained within them. I always felt like I was, like back in the 90s when you'd hire a video game. And if you were lucky, you get the instruction booklet.
Yes.
And that would, you'd be like, from
nostalgia.
The local
Go down the
video
Blockbuster
shop. Yes. And you get the instruction book and you'd read it through if you're anything like me. And, okay, so that's how you do that. But sometimes you'd get it and there'd be no booklet. It's been lost to time or whatever, somebody's nicked it. And it felt like that for me, that I didn't have this instruction booklet that everyone else seemed to have. And everything was there for, even the simplest things were enormously confusing. And everyone else just seemed to be fine, just seemed to get on okay. I mean, obviously they might not have been, you never see what's really going on inside people, but genuinely, people did seem to be pretty okay most of the time.
Yeah, you're feeling like everyone else is playing the game of life on easy mode.
Yeah.
Why am I stuck on hard?
You're playing it on hard in a different language.
Yeah.
Without
the instruction manual.
Yeah, exactly. And you've got no idea what's going on. Yeah. I mean, the one thing about that is, though, that once you do start to get it, a bit like if anyone's ever been in that situation with a video game, I think you actually become weirdly better at it as a result of that, because you've had to really work for it. Whereas for people for whom it's a bit more automatic, can just bumble through. And I think a lot of autistic people, because of our masking, and we learn habits and we learn behaviors very manually, and we monitor people and we watch people and we try and figure out what's going on. And I think as a result of that, paradoxically, we then become very, like, some of the autistic people I know are some of the most charismatic people you could meet because they've nailed it, And then if you get them away from other people, they'll kind of crumble into a more kind of like, maybe quite introverted state. And, you'll see kind of what they might be kind of like underneath the mask. But I do see that a lot, very, very socially capable autistic people for whom it's hard won. They've really had to work on that, and they can only do it for a little while before. After this today, I'm maybe coming across quite, chatty, and after on the drive home, I'm going to be, a nervous wreck, thinking about everything I've said.
What did I say in that interview?
Yeah. Oh God, did I, say anything terrible? Did I use any bad language? Oh God, like that. And that's often how it is, I think.
Yeah. Well, I can reassure you, you're coming across absolutely perfectly.
So Thank you.
What chapter of your life, Pete, did the diagnoses come? Is there a story there?
It was parenthood.
Right.
as it so often is in various different ways. Parenthood is a big pipeline to diagnosis. Often, of course, it's because your child gets diagnosed. That's a really common thing that we see all the time. You know, your kid's diagnosed at school, and then you go through that process with them, and you're like, hang on a minute, this sounds an awful lot like me.
I do that too.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people who have been diagnosed via that route. But for me, it was, you know, right at the very beginning of parenthood, you know, when my daughter was born, and I just collapsed. You know, I just could not cope. I thought it was postpartum, you know, paternal postpartum depression for a time, but it went on too long and it was too severe to maybe be that. So we were casting around, and I think it was my partner who said to me, "Have you considered autism?" And I kind of had. I'd looked into autism before. I taught a lot of autistic students,
Sure.
you know, at school, and I knew some autistic family members of colleagues and friends and things like that. And I'd always kind of thought, almost semi-jokingly to myself, oh, you know, I relate to that. You know, I can kind of see a lot of that in myself. But because I'd been in a band, and because I was a teacher, and because I had a very old-fashioned view of what autism was at that point, I didn't really understand it. I just assumed I couldn't be. But when that kind of seed was dropped into my head and I started looking into it, and I started reading more modern thoughts on what autism was, it all started to make a bit more sense. And then it was a very straightforward case of going to the doctors. I mean, this was 2017, pre-COVID. So for me to get a diagnosis on the NHS was relatively easy. You know, I feel kind of bad for saying it because the waiting list now is, you know, 1 million years.
Sure.
But back in 2017, it was 6 months, I think, between being, what's the word, you know, when the doctor, you know, gives you off to a consultant.
Refers.
Thank you. That's the one. To diagnosis, it was really streamlined. It was pretty good. And you know, looking back, I tend to make a joke of this when I talk about it in public, but you know, ultimately, I'm a very routine-based person. My stress levels are so high, I need to have a really strict daily routine. You know, really have things very, very similar every single day, like many autistic people do. And of course, you become a parent. That's gone.
Yeah.
You can't do that anymore. And also, my sensory sensitivity is very much based around, I mean, temperature is one, but two other big ones are sound and smell. And, you know, don't be too crass, but a new baby,
Yeah.
you can see where that goes. And I just found it overwhelming in the worst possible way. You know, it was rough. It was a rough time.
Having ADHD and autism, being AuDHD, how could those two conditions clash within somebody?
In so many ways. Well, sometimes they clash. Sometimes I feel that they really complement each other. It just seems to depend on the day and the situation. I've read a lot on this, and I've thought about it a lot myself, you know, ever since my ADHD diagnosis. I think in some ways they do clash. They do, yes, because my autistic brain, if you like, you know, the autistic side or portion or cells or however it works, they want to do things this way. You know, that part of me really does want things to be very set down, very clear, very unambiguous. I want to know what I'm doing before time. I want to check on Google Maps to know that I'm going exactly the right direction, that it's going to start at this point and finish at this point. You know, I want everything set. But then the other side, like this morning, for example, I had my tube journey from my hotel absolutely set in stone. I knew exactly what I was doing, where I was going. And then at the last minute, I thought, I'm going to drive. Never driven in central London in my entire life. But part of me just thought, no, I need something different now. I don't know why. And to me, I think what happened there was an ADHD part of me in some way that I can't really explain took over and wanted an adventure.
Yeah.
and won. It won. And I drove. And it was fine. But it was a gamble. It was a risk. You know, I mean, it's scary out there.
Yeah.
I had no idea where to park. But for some reason, that thrill seeking and spur of the moment, you know, let's just change our plans all at once, just took over. And Yeah, sure, today it worked, but other days it doesn't. Other days it causes all kinds of problems. So I find myself walking this fine line between absolute predictability and total unpredictability. And it's like whichever way I go, I don't win. I can't win because the other part of me is going to be upset.
Yeah. I suppose the sort of the ADHD impulsivity, wanted adventure, wanted to have fun driving. Was there a bit of pushback or resistance to the tube as well because that was a sensitivity, the heat, the noise
There was.
against your autism, probably
Yes.
pushing the ADHD to act on that impulsivity to drive?
I think so. I think that was probably the thing that sparked it,
Yes.
the catalyst of it all, because it's pretty hot today. The hotel room where I was staying had very poor air conditioning. So, I woke up thinking, oh God, it's too hot. And the thought of going on the Central line, which is famously the hottest tube line of all, just didn't appeal. And because, as an autistic person who's got heat sensitivity, it's bad. It's really bad when you're too hot. I genuinely started to fear that I wouldn't be able to do this, that I get here in such a state, I'd be so kind of close to meltdown that I'd just kind of turn up and burst into tears or something. So yeah, that did kind of spur on, well, I could drive, but I think the ADHD in me, that's that yearning for unpredictability and new things, picked that up and went, go on then, let's do that. Yeah, good idea. Against perhaps my better judgment, I don't know.
Yeah, very relatable. You talk a lot, Pete, on social media about autism and depression. Your AuDHD, autism and ADHD. Do you think someone with AuDHD, how they combat depression, do you think that's a unique challenge for them?
I think it could be. Yeah, I think when you talk about autism alone with depression, that to me, it makes quite a lot of sense. I can kind of see the pattern. I mean, we talked about it earlier, the feeling of othering, the feeling of being misunderstood a lot, that sensory overwhelm constantly getting you down. That makes sense. When you put ADHD into the pot, it all becomes a little bit more complicated, I think. Because in some ways, the ADHD can almost hide or cancel out the autism and vice versa. I think that's why so many people are late diagnosed with both, because autism and ADHD have kind of worked together to almost smooth off the rough edges a little bit. It's been less noticeable. Your ADHD kind of neuters the autism a bit. The autism neuters the ADHD a little bit too. So you get through life without realizing, and then you're diagnosed in your 30s or your 40s, when things start to fall apart a little bit, maybe. And for that reason, perhaps depression might be less forthcoming. I'm not sure about that. I mean, it certainly didn't work for me because I I get depressed an awful lot. I think when there's both interacting, I think that feeling that I alluded to earlier of never being able to please all of your brain probably feeds into it. Like a feeling like part of you is always compromising in a way that it really doesn't want to. Either your autisticness or ADHDness is having to kind of bend over and be like, okay, fine, and I think that can be very hard on a daily basis, because you're always going to feel some part of your soul kind of is always going to feel unhappy, if that makes sense. It's a difficult thing to think about. I think that the ADHD side as well, interacting with the autistic side, is constantly maybe feeling a bit smothered as well by, like in my case, my ADHD impulsivities, which I think could actually often be quite a good thing. Like it proved today, for example, driving here rather than, or, like just the impulse to get up and do some drawing, or get up and do something a bit different. I'm not going to do my routine today. I'm going to change things up. I'm going to go and eat in a restaurant. I'm going to go to the pub. I'm going to do something a bit different. Is so often crushed by my need for order and predictability. So I don't end up doing things that could actually probably do me a lot of good, like a walk out or a trip somewhere new, or just a quiet pint in a nice country pub, which I could easily do, but I don't find myself doing it because the other part of my brain has said, no. We're not doing that. You don't normally do that, so you're not doing that today. And I think that makes it hard to escape bad patterns that you might get yourself into. You know, because one thing about depression is, you know, you do have to be quite active to escape it. You know, it's almost like, it's like a planet's gravity. You know, you've got to reach escape velocity to get out of its grasp. And to do that, you have to maybe go for a walk or do some mindfulness or do things very actively. You know, you've got to decide to do things and follow them through. And maybe my autistic desire to stick with the same stuff can make that very, very difficult.
I feel like it goes without saying, I think communication is so important to tackle depression. And I guess Ned Hallowell said with all of these things that many of the topics on this podcast is never worry alone, open up, share the load. I mean, it's a common ground in terms of advice. But I feel like with someone with ADHD, you can impulsively, in moments perhaps, open up to someone. But then you could go away from that social encounter and almost overthink it. I don't know if that's the autistic flaring up and then making you anxious. And could that create sort of a toxic avoidance loop of not wanting to open up because you're so fearful of the overthinking that follows?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Very much so, actually. You know, rumination, as we call it, is such a key facet of being autistic. But the interesting thing about that overthinking, it's often described as just being a kind of inherent ingredient of autism. You know, it just is a bit like routine. When actually, it's not. There's a reason for it. You know, there's a very clear reason why we ruminate, and that's because of the fact that autistic communication is genuinely different to non-autistic. You know, there's a very different communicative culture that comes along with being an autistic person. You know, we are, and I'm generalizing here, so anyone listening to this or watching this to whom this doesn't apply, remember the spectrum is broad, we're all very different. But generally speaking, autistic people are often, you know, very blunt, you know, very to the point, often to the point of being described as rude. We might not make eye contact. We might prefer to speak in longer utterances. You know, that's a big thing. We might like to focus our attention on transactional, like getting things done. You know, we like to talk to achieve things rather than any other purpose. These are all things that I think can be, you know, described as a different culture. This means that there are cultural clashes, though, where our type of communication clashes with the majority non-autistic type. And who comes out worse from that? Well, it's the minority. It's us. You know, we were historically described as being poor communicators because we didn't communicate in that very particular way. We do it our own way. And I think that feeds that rumination because you feel like you're having to, you know, imagine going to France. Imagine that you spend a holiday in France and you don't only want to learn the language, but you want to act fully French. You want to absorb every cultural quirk and difference and, you know, variation that French communication has as opposed to English. So differences in body language, differences in frequency of swearing, differences in gesture, differences in facial expression. You want to try and do all of that. Imagine how stressed you'd be constantly. You know, if you really wanted, like a spy, you really wanted to fit in. You know, there's that wonderful moment in Inglourious Bastards, the film, where the English spy is in the beer cellar. Yeah, he does, and he asks for three. That's what gives glasses. Him away. Yeah, and the Nazi looks at him and knows immediately because that is the correct thing. To be autistic is a bit like that. we want to naturally do that, and we're constantly judged because we don't do that. And so we're having to monitor our behavior all the time to try and fit in with what's acceptable. This is what leads to rumination because you're looking back afterwards thinking, God, did I do their thing? I can't have done my things. I'm not allowed to do that. I'm not allowed to communicate in my own way. I have to do it their way. And did I succeed? I don't know. And you're waiting for the feedback. You're waiting for the, why did you do that? Why did you say that? Why on earth did you ask them that question? You know, from loved ones or friends or whoever who give you that, you know, I call it the debrief after a social event where you get all this, you know, criticism about all the stuff you did wrong. No wonder we ruminate. Of course we ruminate. Who wouldn't? You know, like it's perfectly natural if you are exposed to that to be constantly anxious. And that then feeds into the rumination, into the depression, into the anxiety. And ADHD, I think, can open that up a little bit. It can perhaps help with that a tad, because it can, for me, for example, I can sometimes just decide I'm not going to even think about that. I'm not going to ruminate anymore. I'm going to do something else. My brain just shoots off in a different direction. But equally, sometimes it can make it even worse, because your impulsivity in the moment makes you say and do things that are definitely going to be picked up on and you're going to get criticized for. So it's just this kind of tumult, this chaos of communication that I think AuDHD people honestly need a medal for getting through any kind of conversation with a judgmental neurotypical person.
Yes, without also sensing a little change in tone of voice and being triggered by RSD, which I want to talk about later on.
Yeah.
With ADHD, I always feel like, because what you said earlier, we have had to mask all our lives in order to fit in. We're very good at problem solving. Same applies with autism. Do you think there's a risk that the problem solving ability of people with AuDHD could make them vulnerable when they're depressed, because the autistic side of their brain might see the solution to the problem of depression, and the impulsivity that comes with ADHD might make them act on it in that moment?
Yeah. I think that is, I think it's actually an increasingly well understood mechanic that does happen. Yeah. Which is incredibly dangerous for obvious reasons. I've often heard it said, and I'm trying to think of some examples. There are studies on this, I think. University of Nottingham, Dr. Sarah Cassidy, I think. I'm not very good with names off the top of my head, but has done some great work into autism and suicidality. And yeah, the kind of, the problem solving of autism too, as well as ADHD, looking for what looks like the most logical, most sensible solution can obviously lead you down that very dark avenue. And then if you throw in the impulsivity of an ADHD person who might just think, actually, you know what? Yep, let's do it. I mean, it's a dangerous cocktail. And I don't think it's well understood by healthcare. In fact, no, I know it's not well understood by healthcare, having worked with the NHS now for a number of years. Doctors, nurses, clinicians do not understand this mechanic. They do not get it. They don't realize how fragile or how primed that tinderbox is, to just going up in smoke. And they go through the usual motions, just the usual kind of, following the pattern of treatment, the flow chart or whatever, without realizing that actually in this case, this person is in tremendous danger. Hence, what we talked about at the beginning about my mission. I just want people to know this stuff,
yes, yeah.
Because then if you go to emergency care as an AuDHD individual, you'll be actually understood. Because often what happens if you are really in trouble, if you're really ill, mentally, with mental health, depression, etc., and as an autistic person in particular, you go to the health system, the likelihood is that you will end up being institutionalized. And this, I'm rubbish with statistics, but I think it's something like the average length of stay for an autistic person in inpatient care is something like 100 times longer than a non-autistic person. I think it racks up into the years on average, because once an autistic person is in institutionalized care, they no longer have autonomy. So they can't manage their sensory experience. They can't manage their special interests or their monotropism. They can't, and they might have their phone taken away. They might not have a tablet to play around with. They might have nothing to calm themselves down. They might be told off for stimming. They might be forced to eat food they don't like, forced into wards that are too bright, too hot, too cold, too noisy. And it just spirals. You end up worse than you were when you went in. And the whole time, the medical establishment is throwing its hands in the air saying, we don't know what to do with these people. And it's like, come on, it's not rocket science. They just need a bit of autonomy. They need some calm. They need a place to hide. They need a way to engage in their interests. Give them a blooming phone, for goodness sake, or a Switch or something, give them something to do. The situation when you are mentally ill as an AuDHD person can be really dangerous, really fraught. And there's not enough general understanding of that at this time.
A quick word from our sponsors to address a big ADHD issue, the notebook fallacy. We all convince ourselves that buying that one magic notebook will solve all of our problems, but it never does. Nor does the second one, or the third, or the 10th. Well, Tiimo app is more useful than having all the notebooks in the world. And what use are notebooks if you keep losing your pen anyway? Tiimo app has hugely helped me organize my chaotic life by offering the most user-friendly interface an organizational app has to offer. The difference is, it's designed by neurodiverse brains for neurodiverse brains. And you can tell, it's built to adapt to your neurodiverse way of thinking and be flexible to your way of planning. And now it's even more simple with the AI planning assistant. Tiimo now offers an incredible new voice transcribing service, making it even easier to use. A simple voice prompt when you have to plan something or something pops into your mind, and the new AI planning assistant hears it and transcribes it instantly into an easily digestible list of instructions for you to remember. Tiimo is here to help you simplify planning, build focus, and make life happen. No more decision paralysis. The new AI planning assistant makes it so quick and easy to insert information, you can do it before you've forgotten or been distracted. Give it a go and use the link in my bio for 30% off. Just a note though, this code is only applicable on the web browser, not on the smartphone. Then when Tiimo solves all of your problems, go ahead and use your notebooks for something useful, like propping up a wobbly table leg or mopping up a spilt coffee. Back to the episode.
Do you think people with AuDHD navigate the landscape of jealousy and relationship endings and breakups differently? Like, if you are obsessed with someone, if someone is your special interest, and the thought of that coming to an end, plus somebody else spending time with your ex, can that be magnified in the mind of someone with AuDHD and potentially put that person in a very vulnerable position in that stage?
I think so. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, in my life, I've experienced that a number of times on both sides, as both the person who's been left and also the person that has left. And yeah, the pathways that your brain can go down in those times can be really scary. It's interesting what you said about, a person becoming a special interest, because that is a very distinct thing, I think. I mean, it's one thing having your special interest be like, Sonic the Hedgehog or Thomas the Tank Engine or quarries or knitting or whatever. That's one thing. That's fine. But if your special interest is very much a person and then that person is gone, you've lost, not only have you lost a relationship, which in itself obviously is harrowing and painful, and nearly every human being watching this will know that very well, but you've lost a regulation thing. You've lost a means of self-care, because that's what special interests are. They help us stay grounded, they help us stay calm, and they help us stay relatively happy, for want of a better word. So if that's tied in with a person, and then that's gone, then you've lost two things. You've lost two massive things. And I think that can be truly devastating, absolutely devastating. And again, people won't understand why. You'll get the usual, plenty more fish in the sea, or whatever people say. And that won't cut it, because you've lost too much. You've lost more than you ever thought you were likely to. And that puts an awful lot of pressure on you, and it puts a lot of pressure on the other person too, because they're finding themselves in a situation where you can feel very, you're going to feel very guilty, aren't you, if you know that this is happening, but you had to go. The guilt is going to be all consuming. So yeah, it's not a topic that I tend to talk about, because my my lifetime of experience in that particular field is not great. It's always been a real challenge for me. But yeah, it is a very interesting double whammy, I think, when it happens, for sure.
You think post-breakup, the idea, the hyper-focus and the way to, maybe the autistic ability to repeat a thought, like the thought of somebody else spending time with your ex, can that be significantly more challenging for someone who is AuDHD than perhaps just a neurotypical person?
Yeah, I think so. If you've got the ADHD kind of, repeated, thoughts kind of repeatedly going, not being able to quiet it down, not being able to get rid of it and move on to something different, that's going to obviously be very difficult, because a whole part of moving on from a breakup and a whole part of moving on from any kind of grief, like losing a family member, for example, or a friend, is that lessened frequency of thinking about them. That's what happens, isn't it? It's what's meant to happen. You're meant to gradually think about them less and less. Not to the point of nothing, but the idea is that you're meant to start to, focus on other things. They say, don't you, that day when you don't realize you haven't thought about them once is the day that you're maybe recovered from your grief or from your breakup experience or from losing a grandparent or whatever. I have a suspicion, though, that when you're AuDHD, or even just ADHD alone, that moment may never come. Or at least it'll be massively elongated because those thoughts are just churning constantly. Your brain is so busy. And that person will constantly come to the forefront for much longer than it maybe would for a neurotypical person. So, whereas one person might be over it or, past their grief after a year or two, you might be 5 years later and still it's there. Unbidden thoughts, they're coming into your head, you're remembering them. And yeah, I think that's a very real thing. And again, it's not something you see talked about much. Certainly not in the kind of spheres that I exist in. We all tend to try to avoid the topic. But I think that it is very much I've talked about grief before in this idea. I think that autistic people, for example, grieve differently. In my own experience, I think that our initial grief might be less because so many autistic people I know have been kind of criticized for not being upset enough, if that makes sense. But I think the grief lasts longer.
Yeah. So I've spoken to so many people with autism and they've described being told that they don't have a heart sometimes.
Yes, that we don't have any emotions. It's like, no, actually, I am hurting, but it's not like all consuming, but it's there. Like, like radioactive, it's just there underlying everything. And it lasts, and it lasts. I like to talk about, the loss of my granddad, a person who was very important to me. He died when I was 17. And quite honestly, I feel exactly the same now as I did in 2000, 25 years ago. I feel the same level of grief. Sure, I'm not like, clawing up the curtains and, wearing black every day, but it's the same level of, still there in my head. I'm still thinking about him pretty much every day. Still pops in there, still feel very sad about it. It's never changed. It's been this kind of constant for the whole time.
And I suppose you can have days where you're absolutely fine and you're maybe not thinking about them to a level that's almost derailing you, but something can snap you back into it, like a memory, a smell, a song, a sound, and your mood changes to such a drastic extent that people around you even label you as like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or even suggest, have you got BPD perhaps?
Yeah. I mean, very, very common misdiagnosis, isn't it? BPD, especially for autistic women. I think that's true. I mean, when you factor in the sensory sensitivity that autistic people have, for example, to smells, sounds, tastes, whatever, then yeah, that's going to be a huge factor. It'll take a smell to set me off.
Yeah.
Like smells that remind me of my granddad's home, or the cigars he used to smoke, which, to be fair, you don't smell that often these days. But, they take you straight back. And same with songs from a particular era. They're all very evocative. And I think for autistic people in particular, with our sensory sense and with how important our senses are to us, because I think we get a bit over fixated, on focusing on the negatives of sensory sensitivity. I mean, yeah, sure, it is difficult, being too hot, being too bright, being too noisy, but there's a huge positive aspect to it. If you are truly that sensitive to stuff, well, that can be good. Like being sensitive to music, being sensitive to nice smells, being sensitive to colours and brightness in a way that's pleasing can be enormously powerful. Is maybe a reason why so many autistic people are creative, and very creatively minded, because we're so tuned in with our sensory world, So yeah. I think that there's a lot to be said about AuDHD and loss and grief and relationships generally. Absolutely.
Pete, has RSD been a big feature in your life?
It has. Yeah. Rejection sensitivity. It's one of the most defining features of my life, I would say, because I really, really struggle with it. It's really difficult for me. Any kind of criticism, rejection itself, of course, real or perceived. I will, my brain will go completely wild with it. At work, that was a big thing for me. In interpersonal relationships, it's a huge problem. As an author, it's a nightmare. I can't even look at my reviews anymore because, it doesn't matter how many good ones you get. That has no impact whatsoever. Like you could have, I don't have this, but some presumably do. You can have like 1,000 5-star reviews and 1 star.
Yes, that's the one you think about when you're lying in bed.
Exactly. It's a cliche, but it's real. It really does haunt you. And for me, the ADHD aspect of RSD is not being able to stop thinking about it. Like, I wish that I could check Amazon, click on the reviews, see there was a 1 star, feel a bit glum about it, be like, oh, for God's sake, and then move on with my day. But I can't. It would haunt me for, based on experience, probably about a week or two.
And you create stories in your head to reaffirm the thing that's triggered your RSD.
You do.
That paragraph I wrote in chapter 3 was terrible. And
it must have been that. Or it must have been that. Or, oh God, it must have been something I've done. Or, you do. And sometimes, and I remember writing about this in my second book, Untypical, sometimes your fears, your paranoia about criticism are proven right. And that for me is the real killer. Because what that does is it tells that little voice, you were right. And that gives it confidence.
Yes.
And as a teacher in particular, I had several experiences of that where I was genuinely really nervous because I felt like something was wrong. And I felt like somebody, that people weren't happy or that, criticism was coming. And everyone was like, oh, you're fine, you're fine. And then one day, bang, it had been all along, and that haunts you because you think, oh, you can never relax. You never know when it's going to come. And I think one reason that ADHD and autistic people have RSD, I'm a big proponent of the trauma theory of RSD because many people's RSD response is very much a trauma response. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. It's one of those. And I think because when you're neurodivergent, you are liable to be criticized throughout your life. And not only that, not only the frequency of it, which is very frequent, but also the unexpectedness of it. As an autistic person, for example, you will just be bumbling through your day. And like I mentioned earlier, you'll say something or you'll ask a question and you'll get, attacked. How dare you? How dare you ask that? Or why can't you look me in the eye when you talk to me? These criticisms come out of nowhere. You're trying to be your best self. As a kid, you're trying to be really well behaved, but people will still be really upset with you for some reason. And I think over time, you become hyper vigilant. Like, where's the next criticism going to come from? I don't know. It's like being in a war zone when there's a sniper somewhere. And any minute it could happen and you just don't know when it's going to happen. So you naturally become really paranoid, really anxious, very stressed because it's coming, but you don't know where it's going to come from, who it's going to come from, or how severe it's going to be. And for me, that's been, a major part. It's impacted jobs, it's impacted relationships, It's ended relationships. It's been a real problem for me. And I've never found a way to mitigate it. I've done therapy, medication, lots of things like that. And nothing yet has managed to even touch the sides.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly relatable. I think RSD is one of those things I've been down every Google rabbit hole, how to manage, how to cure, how to fix RSD, because it's debilitating. But I'm 36 and it's as raw today as it has been my entire life. I think it was yesterday I got invited to a social gathering. And then, if you like was at the end of the text in response to can I come? Yes, you can come if you like. And I zoomed in on those 3 words, if you like. And to me, that sounded like I'm a burden to them. They're just saying come because they don't want to upset me. And, it instantly triggered me, instantly felt that tightening in my chest.
Yes.
It's 3 little words. If you like, it's probably just social lubrication from their point of view. But for me, I took it
they probably never gave it a second thought.
I thought they hated me.
Yeah, absolutely. Same with full stops. I don't know about whether you've noticed this, but like texting, messaging, punctuation usage, for me, like triggers me massively. Like if people, like, this is a really weird one. I don't know whether anyone will relate to this, but if somebody asks me a question without a question mark at the end, for some reason I associate that with them being angry with me. I do not know why. I don't know whether that's from experience, that part of my brain has over time collated evidence for this that I haven't got conscious access to, but I have noticed it, and therefore it's a thing now. I don't know. I've got no idea.
My mind would read that as to say I'm not important enough in their mind to
warrant
finish the
button.
sentence properly.
I think that could be
they
the
wrote that
source
in such
of
a
it.
rush because
Yes.
I'm so meaningless to them that they didn't put the question mark at the end.
But the thing with RSD is, I'm feeling it now, that anyone listening to this now who hasn't experienced it will just be sitting there thinking, oh, for goodness sake, grow up. Like,
stop being so sensitive.
Yeah, grow a pair or whatever horrible thing people say. And it's like, no, you've got no idea.
Yeah.
Like, it's really bad. We don't want this. This isn't us wallowing in it. I mean, I would turn it off in an instant if I could. It's awful. But it's always there. And like I say, when eventually, you get evidence that actually you were right, your paranoid thoughts were right, that just makes it even worse. And social gatherings, social expectations, the feeling of being a burden. You mentioned that a moment ago. God, that's a big one that I think a lot of autistic people will probably relate to. I mean, I think it's even in some NHS documentation, did you know? Not in a good way, not in like, the patient may feel a burden. It's actually written in, I remember seeing this a few years ago, it's actually written in some paperwork about how autistic people are a burden.
Right.
That their being a burden will impact their family, etc., etc. Awful, horrible stuff. And I think we feel that very deeply. We feel broken. We feel like I have a genuine fear, and I'm going a little bit, I'm doing my whole too much information thing now, but I have a genuine feeling, and I think a lot of autistic ADHD people do, that I don't bring anything good to anyone's life. That all I ever bring is more stress, to friends and family. That, it doesn't matter how nice I try to be or how helpful I try to be, that ultimately the net, the net gain is purely negative. But, I bring people down, I make people stressed, I make people tired, people get fed up with me, and I'm not saying that to be kind of self-pitying, might be a little bit, but mostly because I think that I'm probably not alone in that. I think that many neurodivergent people will feel that we are just bothersome.
And I suppose if you have that thought process, your mind will have a bias to turn a neutral comment into a negative.
Into that, yes. You're always going to be looking for evidence for it.
Yeah. So if you invite someone over and you say, do you want to come over? You text them and they reply with sure. Just sure. No emojis, no kisses, just sure. It's 4 letters for me that it's reinforcing that inner monologue that you just described perfectly, that, they're just coming over because I've asked them and they don't want to
they feel obligated.
They feel like they have to, and I'm a burden to them. It's the unpredictability of it. Like a simple sure can turn a good mood into the polar opposite, and how that must look from other
God,
people
yeah.
around us as a community. You can see why people say, "Oh, you've got drastic mood swings. You're Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Well,
you were fine 5 minutes ago."
But also on a personal level, I resent it as well, because for me, it's so difficult to get in a good mood, you know, with a lifetime of anxiety and depression and all that kind of stuff, you know, hanging over me, and, you know, sensory overwhelm and just being very tired and very stressed all the time. You know, being in a good mood for me is precious. Like, my God, you know, when I find myself in that frame of mind, it's like, oh, I've got to keep this for as long as I can. And then something like that happens, and it's like, oh God, you know, oh, I was feeling okay, and now it's back again, you know. And that for me is it's heartbreaking, but it also ends up breeding a totally unreasonable resentment against whoever or whatever the source of that was, which is so unhealthy and unhelpful, because they didn't mean anything by it. They probably didn't even mean anything negative, but you've read something negative into it. It's trashed your mood, and part of you is like, you know?
I swear to RSD must be the cause of so many breakups because of that
absolutely is.
resentment, which is really not even based off anything real, but and your partner's only going to have patience and empathy towards that for so long.
It can only go so far. Yeah. And then it when that breaks, that I think that then propagates the total, you know, it's like a Jenga tower. You know, you take that tolerance and patience goes, and then the whole structure tumbles. And I've you know, personally seen a lot. I've seen it in friends and family. You know, you see it a lot in the autistic community, I think, and it's heartbreaking because, again, like everything else, it's not talked about. So people don't know what they are dealing with. You know, they don't know that this is a thing. Even if you went out into the street and asked some random people down the road here, what's RSD? Most of them would look at you blankly. But they might find themselves in a relationship with a neurodivergent person who's got severe RSD, and, you know, it could end up being quite difficult for both of them. But if they at least knew about it, maybe things might be a bit easier. I don't know. You know, at least then you're playing with a full deck. You know what you're getting yourself into, you know, which might help.
We're two men having an open conversation about RSD here today, emotions, heartbreak.
It feels quite unusual, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, it really does. But it's sad that it feels unusual because I feel like it's not something that I still am comfortable talking about. I think many men aren't also comfortable talking about. Why do you think? It's a big question, but why do you think men aren't as comfortable to talk about emotions?
I mean, toxic masculinity affects us all, doesn't it? Whatever that means. This idea of an idealized man, whatever that would look like, I think throughout many cultures over history has totally ignored the mental health side of things. You know, if you look at, you know, as a literature student, you know, you look back over stories over the years, and, you know, the emotional well-being of male characters and heroes isn't usually at the top of the tree. You know, I mean, just to be really crass about it, no one cares all that much about how Indiana Jones is feeling right now. You know, maybe there's that scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark where he's been beaten up and Karen Allen is kind of gingerly patching him up on the ship. You know, it's a lovely, quite funny scene. You know, the physical pain is fine. We can deal with that. He's been beaten up. He's bruised. You know, Daredevil covered in bruises, bits of glass. John McClane with glass in his feet. We can deal with that, and we can empathize with that. And that story is okay. The story of physical harm and recuperation is something we can all get behind. We're all happy with that. But the mental equivalent, a male character or a male protagonist or whatever, having emotional depth and feeling, we're not okay with that, I don't think. As a society, we don't value it. We don't care about it all that much. You know, we're not all that in tune with it. It is not something that I think we tend to foreground. I think we tend to prefer to put it away. We don't, as men, I don't think we want to admit to it because we don't want to admit weakness, because the whole idea of, you know, masculinity is all forged around this concept of strength, you know, strength and power and all this kind of nonsense. And I think that anything that goes against that or suggests that you might have a weakness or or a frailty, flaw even, is something that we are. I mean, I often wonder how much of it is like, really prehistoric. Like we have a prehistoric terror of being vulnerable, because presumably at some point in our evolutionary history that was very dangerous. Like it would lead to death, kind of thing. I don't know. I mean, I'm spitballing very much here, but it is a real problem, I think, that we still, even in 2025, associate mental health and feelings and emotional states and sadness and grief and woe and all that stuff with some kind of perceived weakness that is very impactful in the workplace, especially, I think. The cutthroat nature of workplaces, even those workplaces that like to pretend that they're not cutthroat. You got like the city, which is openly, competitive and cutthroat. But God, you see it in schools, you see it in hospitals. They're all the same. They're all deeply competitive places where you've got to, be on the ball all the time. And any kind of, you take a few days off sick and sorry, mate, you're out. That's not going to fly here. That's the general gist of society. You're not allowed these moments of vulnerability and frailty. You're off on the scrap heap immediately. You're put out to pasture, I think, either, metaphorically or literally. So we all just hide it. We don't want to let that out. We don't want to talk about that. I'm in a position, and you presumably too, where the nature of my work is paradoxically one where I'm allowed to open up about it. I'm kind of almost expected to. But even then I feel really nervous about doing it. Really kind of anxious about, oh God, what people are going to think, like, and yeah, I think that societal traditions and societal expectations and things that have crusted up over hundreds of years are the main cause of this. And we need to break through it. We need to clean it off a little bit.
Do you think men feel like there is this unspoken currency that defines their worth, and that being respect? You said strength, but also respect. And do you think they fear that if they are vulnerable and show their emotional side, they might lose that respect with women?
Oh God, I mean, possibly. There's a lot of conflicting narratives around this that I come across online in particular. In my experience, being vulnerable with women doesn't tend to necessarily end badly at all. In my very really quite limited experience, I think it's often been quite a good thing, quite a profound thing. But I do know of people. I suppose, people are people, aren't they? We're all different. I guess there are going to be some women who might not like that. There are going to be some who do, some that don't. There are going to be some men that actually are quite kind of cool with this kind of conversation. There are going to be others that won't. And that will probably boil down to their background. Like everything does, it'll boil down to their parents. How did their parents manage this stuff? If their parents managed it well, then they probably will too. If their parents didn't, and their parents didn't, and their parents didn't, then that will continue. That lack of being able to cope will propagate. So I think it really is horses for courses. If you are, but what that means in practice is that it's a real gamble, because who knows how it's going to be met. If you open up to either, to a loved partner, if you open up to a friend, you never know what you're going to be met with. Are they going to be actually genuinely cool with it because, they've got some experience and they're emotionally intelligent and they're a compassionate person and, they want the best for you? Or are you going to be met with somebody who might have been brought up in a very different environment, who's got more of a, dog eat dog kind of attitude, who might not find it attractive, or who might not find it something they want to hang around or be around? You might, harshing someone's mellow, God, that's like 90s slang. I think it makes it a real, a gamble to open up, because you just don't know how this person is going to react to you. And that's really frightening. And therefore, it makes a lot of sense why people would just decide not to roll those dice. Why would you? If you don't know what you're going to get. And especially because it's not necessarily always fairly reciprocated. Like, you might think that this person is going to be cool with it because you've been cool with them. But of course, that's not how it works, because they're not you. They might just have a different set of values entirely. So, you're rolling those dice and you're thinking, how am I going to be met here? Am I going to be met with compassion, understanding, and tolerance, or am I going to be met with intolerance and a lack of understanding and annoyance or whatever? So
I suppose if you want to sort of test the water and figure out if you are going to be met with empathy and kindness, you sort of want to start small, but that might not always be possible with RSD.
Yeah, because small is as big as big. There's no difference in my mind. If you start with something really minor, you may as well be talking about your grief for, your dead dog or something. It's so big. Even if really all you're talking about is the fact that you just, I don't know, died on a video game. It feels so big anyway, and their reaction to you will feel so big that it would, I mean, in some ways you could argue better to know than not. So maybe it's worth rolling those dice just so you can be like, oh, okay, well, at least I know now, and therefore let's not be friends or whatever, but that's a logical and a rational take on human relationships that I don't think stands up in real life. We don't tend to have the ability to just cut things off the moment that we realize, actually, no, that is one red flag too many. I must now end this very cleanly because we're messier than that, aren't we?
Do you think if you have, and you might not know it, but if you have narcissistic parents who didn't make vulnerability and emotional talk commonplace in your childhood, that can leave you more vulnerable to not knowing how to express emotions?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. Yes, yeah. I think, that parental influence is massive for all people, neurodivergent or not. It's primarily what we base our understanding of the world on, the way that our parents interact, the way that our parents behave, the way that our parents frame the world to you as a child is massively important. And yeah, if you're dealing with, something akin to narcissism or, real kind of blockages in emotional display and that kind of thing, then that's going to have a huge knock-on effect on then how you are going to understand your emotional self, how you're going to understand the emotional lives of other people. I mean, my parents are odd ones because, my dad, for example, bless him, he's not the emotional type, but sometimes, I don't know whether he's masking because I think he is autistic and I think he's fine with me to say that. But I think sometimes his mask drops and his real emotional self does shine through. And you see a glimpse then of what's actually going on in there, like behind the wall, which is always really lovely, actually. I quite like it when that happens. And so, but at least then you feel like, it's there, even if it's not necessarily on display. But if it's never there and never on display, that's quite scary, I think. As a child, if your mum or dad or even, grandparent or anyone is like that, that's really frightening because what are they going to do? Like, what's going on here? We base a lot of our lives around emotions and around things that we understand and that we can recognize. And if that information isn't forthcoming, that's scary, I think.
Do you think your ADHD masks better or your autistic side masks better?
I think I hide my autism better than I do my ADHD, for sure, if that makes sense. I think I'm more practiced in it. I think, to be honest with you, the stakes were higher. I think that's a really important thing. The stakes of masking autism or autistic tendencies is way higher in my experience than ADHD. Like, I can get away with being a bit kind of overzealous and over-enthusiastic in a conversation and interrupting or, being forgetful, being disorganized, being kind of, flying around doing different things. I can get away with that without, like, really bad things happening. Whereas openly stimming, or talking at length about something that other people are not interested in, or being overwhelmed by my senses and melting down in public or with people around me, you can't get away with that, and, speaking in a naturally autistic way, not making eye contact, being quite blunt and to the point, they're things that are going to get you punched at school by certain types of children or teachers. So you learn to hide it out of pure necessity. Whereas I do apologize if anyone listening, they really have to hide their ADHD because fair enough, but for me personally, I always felt, looking back, that I had to hide autism because I really had to. ADHD, I only really had to hide in the workplace. I had to give off an image of deft organization in order to be employable. But with all my autistic traits, I have to do that to remain even vaguely likable or acceptable. And that's a much bigger thing. That's a much deeper thing. That means that I think I became more practiced in masking my autistic tendencies.
I've heard you talk about monotropism.
Yeah.
Could you explain what monotropism is and what purpose do you think it serves or importance in this world?
In the world, yeah, interesting. Yeah. Well, monotropism is a concept. It's a theory that was put forward by Dr. Dinah Murray back in the late 90s, early 2000s with Mike Lesser and Wen Larson. I can't remember names. I do apologize, Wen. I'm awful with names. Hopefully you'll be able to find it when you do some research and just put it in the notes. I'm meeting him in Australia in a couple of months, so I need to know his name. But anyway, it was put together. But interestingly, it's a theory that was developed by autistic people rather than the historical research which took place by non-autistic people, kind of studying us like rats in a cage, you know. This was actually an autistic kind of concept about autism. And what the theory suggests is that autistic brains and possibly ADHD brains, it seems to be that this is, I often like to describe it as autism and ADHD are perhaps two sides of the same coin, but we don't know what the coin is, if that makes sense. So we know they're related, but we don't know exactly how. Now, it might be that monotropism is the coin. That is the key that links the two ways of being, the two neurodivergencies together. And it's all about focus. It's all about attention. It's about how we pay attention to things. And the idea goes that non-autistic, neurotypical people are polytropic. They can pay attention to multiple things at once without any real hassle. You know, it doesn't take any extra effort for them. It's fine. Whereas monotropic people, like autistic people, almost certainly ADHD people, have a tendency or are wired, deeply wired to pay attention to one thing at a time at great depth. So the analogy I always give when I do any talk or speech about this is to imagine that you're lying on the sofa at home, relaxing, reading a good book. You're really engrossed in it, and the doorbell rings. Now, if you're polytropic, the likelihood is that you will hear the bell, you will put your book down, fold the page over if you remember to. You'll go and answer the door and you'll get whatever the thing was. And, people often, when I talk about this, treat it like a trick question. Like, no, it's that simple. That's what you will do. And they're like, well, doesn't everyone do that? No, no, we do not. Because if you're monotropic, your attention is on the book because you're reading the book. The doorbell ringing you might not even hear it because your attention is so tunnel focused on the book. I think Kieran Rose describes it as like a gravity well, like you're pulled into it, and the doorbell is not even going to factor. Or you might hear it, but not be able to do anything about it. You can't act on it.
Right.
Because you are stuck in this thing. You can't switch task because it's too hard. You literally can't. You're on this, that you can't do it. So, the person who's knocked or rung the bell goes away and whatever happens, happens. And that for me is a relatively simple way of understanding the difference between the two things. Basically, if you're monotropic, you are able to process information at a tremendous rate, maybe learn very quickly, for example, from whatever you're reading or doing. But the trade-off, if you like, is that you can't switch tasks. Whereas a polytropic person might not learn quite so quickly, but at least they can switch tasks. It's like video game characters, like they've all got pros and cons, haven't they? You've got the tanks who are, kind of heavily armored and lots of health, but they're very slow.
Yeah.
They're very slow, yeah. Or you've got the nimble ones, who are really fast but don't cause much damage. Or you've got the glass cannons who cause loads of damage but get hurt really easily. It's like that,
Everything has a trade-off.
Yeah, exactly. There's always a trade-off. Autistic people, ADHD people can learn very fast. We can go into hyper-focus really quickly, and that can be enormously beneficial. But don't expect us, and this is the key thing, don't expect us to therefore also be able to switch tasks. You can't have it both ways. You know, if you want to employ somebody because they're hyper-focused, then you can't also expect them to change on a dime, you know, turn on a sixpence or whatever. That's, you know, you're being greedy. It doesn't work like that.
Can monotropism cause issues for someone with a neurodivergent condition who might feel like they need to mask to fit in because they might not be able to mask and take on someone's special interest or share an interest with someone else because it's outside their single thing that they're focusing on?
Possibly, yeah, potentially. Yeah, might be that you literally just cannot even feign interest in it because it's so far outside of what you are fixated on at the moment. But I mean, it affects everything. You know, there's a reason why autistic people, for example, tend to prefer one-on-one conversations. Well, because if you're monotropic, I can put my entire attention on you because you're there and we're talking. But if anyone else started talking to me, I would really struggle to bring them in.
That's fascinating, yeah, because I've always been able to have one-to-one chats, but if I'm in a dinner table with lots of people or in a group setting, I almost go non-verbal.
Yeah, because you're expected to be able to task switch. That's what it is. Switching from person A to person B to person C is a form of task switching. And I always like to make the point that if you're polytropic, that's easy. You're like a speedboat, you know, or a jet ski. You can zoom about and zip about to your heart's content. I'm like the Titanic or an oil carrier, you know, a cruise liner or something, you know, massive. And my turning circle is huge. I need time and space to be able to go from one to another, you know? I mean, earlier when we were chatting, people notice this about me when I bring it up. You might notice that I think my attention was more focused on another person who isn't in camera than it was on you, because that's just where my attention was at that time. And it makes me feel ever so bad because I feel like I'm not giving people the attention they need, but I can only do one at a time. It's a real difficulty. And you can imagine that for kids at school, for example, this is nightmarish because the school system, and this is what I'm writing about in my new book, is set up in a very polytropic way. You know, we say to kids, right, kids, you're going to do English for an hour, then you're going to do maths, then you're going to do French, then you're going to do science. And to a polytropic brain that can switch around and zip about, that's fine. That's normal. That's okay. For a monotropic brain, that is absolutely nightmarish. That is the worst possible way of learning anything. We need, you know, if autistic people had their way, if we'd have been the majority, I genuinely believe that the school system would have had either full days of a subject or at least half days. And that would have just been viewed as the natural norm. Today is English. Tomorrow is maths, where you're allowed then to really just focus on that one thing for a prolonged period without anyone expecting you to magically, suddenly be able to, you know, change your focus. Because that's one of the things that makes autistic people in particular overwhelm the most. That expectation of being able to do that. And we can't. And we feel like we're letting people down. And people get very angry with us. You know, come on, over here now. Do this new thing. I can't. I literally can't. But again, we're back to people don't know this stuff, so therefore they don't realise they're putting kids or adults through it.
Fascinating, P. I could genuinely talk to you for hours. I'm going to move the focus back onto your ADHD item,
yes,
though.
Of course. Yes.
Been patiently waiting underneath that cloth. Yes, and I'll reveal it now.
Here we go.
Da-da. That is a Lego train.
It is.
Why does a Lego train represent ADHD or AuDHD? Which?
Well, yeah, autism and ADHD, really. It represents it in a number of ways. This is my own. This is my own design. It's one of my special interests. See, I'm getting all excited. I like to design trains, build them out of Lego because Lego is cool, and also it's a challenge. So it tickles certain parts of my both autistic and ADHD brain. It tickles my autistic brain because it's problem solving. It's something that I have to spend a lot of time on. Like, it took me months to figure this out properly, you know, to make it work and to make it look the way I wanted it to look. And it's a very basic train. It's like like a 060 steam tank engine. You know, it's about as basic as it comes. But it took ages and ages to figure out all the shapes and things. And that is my happy place. You know, that's where I can go into my monotropic flow, you know, just really fixate on it. But it's for ADHD, it's good because it's a brain quieter. It just quietens down my brain.
Mm.
When I'm building Lego, when I'm thinking about it, it just feels like part of my brain is silenced. I'm not on any medication for my ADHD, so I don't know how that feels. But I know from people who are that when it starts to kick in, that they feel like all of a sudden it's very quiet and they can suddenly get things done. And for me, this is the equivalent. You know, I get the same, I guess, kind of feeling from it. Which is, you know, for somebody who can't get medication at the moment for various reasons, is really, really useful. Because sometimes you need that quiet. You know, you need that space to not be overthinking, not have your brain going at 1,000 miles an hour all the time. It's just contemplate. It's very mindful. It's mindfulness, really. And that's what this represents for me. I mean, trains and Lego, as people that have read my first book will know, are special interests anyway. You know, they're deeply important to me. I mean, the whole first chapter of what I want to talk about was dedicated to Lego as a whole, because it is, you know, such an integral part of my life. So I thought it would make sense for me to bring something made of Lego along today.
It's really fascinating. I mean, you say it's basic. I'm sure that the process to make it was far from basic, and I very much doubt that most people would not be able to do what you've done, which is to make something out of nothing.
Well, it's a strange thing, because, you know, when you're first messing around with it and trying to get the shapes right, it's just chaos. It's just a mess. You know? But then once you've got the basics of the shape right, you can then start to tweak it and shave it down a little bit and think, actually, this would look better like this, or this would work better. It's a bit like writing, actually. You know, you write, or at least how you're meant to write. I don't really write like this, but I know you're meant to write like this. You write your thing, and then you go back to it and you edit it down, and you shave it all off, and you tidy it up, and you neaten it up, and you make it more efficient. It's just that in plastic brick form, really. You know, you're just perfecting something, which is a nice feeling.
I'm glad you brought your ready-made one. It's like, here's one I made earlier. Because last minute bought a Lego train, but it's still in this box. But by the next episode, I promise the viewers that it will be on the on the shelves.
Yeah, because sadly you're not allowed mine, because I need to keep that.
I want to do the ADHD agony aunt section, Pete.
Yes,
just penultimately, every week the community write in with their woes, and it goes in the washing machine of woes, because my ADHD item is a washing machine, because I always leave my laundry in the machine.
Although yes, that's relatable.
How often do you leave your laundry in the machine?
Too often. Yeah. Too often. You know, the amount of times you have to rewash it.
Yeah, I say good because it's nice to feel like you're not the only one.
It's not objectively good, but it's certainly relatable.
Although I have been using the Tiimo app, Pete, which has been a tremendous help to help me remember emptying my washing machine.
Very good. Very good.
This week, Pete, in the washing machine, someone's written in and asked, can I keep this anonymous? I'm a 35-year-old male and been diagnosed with AuDHD, but I don't want to discuss it with my friends because I don't want to talk about feelings. But the feeling of being isolated is leading me to suicidal thoughts. What can I do about this? And how can I open up to them and get them to open up to me too?
Goodness me, yeah, what a difficult one. It's very hard. I mean, how do I say this as somebody who doesn't open up to my own friends very much about this kind of thing, although as we've got older, we've got a bit better at that kind of thing. I think it's about gradation, take it gently. Often it's probably worth thinking about how much they might want to be doing it just like you do, but just haven't, like you, got the wherewithal to actually get the ball rolling. You know, we talked earlier, didn't we, about, you know, starting something off gently, you know, just kind of testing the water. And I think that this is a good example of that, of where that can be a really good method. Because what you very rarely might find is that once the dam breaks, you know, things will be really different and much better, you know, and you'll be able to talk more deeply about things. I think it's certainly worth dipping your toe in and just kind of, maybe you don't want to come straight out and say, hey, everybody, I'm autistic. Because as you probably know, people don't know what that means and will have all kinds of preconceptions and stereotypes, which you don't want to have to be dealing with. That's really not fun, to have to educate them as well. Like you come out as something and you've also got to explain what it means. It's something that a lot of minority groups experience, that pressure to educate when you haven't got the energy to do that. Why should you? It's not your job. So you might want to hold off on that until you feel like they've maybe got a bit more info on that kind of stuff. But you could at least get the ball rolling on emotions. Can start talking about feelings of isolation. I think talking about feelings of isolation in 2025 is actually a fairly natural starting point, because don't we all feel that now? You could even couch it just in general chit chat about technology, the future, politics, if you talk about that kind of thing. We are all very isolated these days, by our work-life balance. Start talking about like working from home, get the ball rolling in that direction, and then segue into feeling isolated, and then segue into, well, how do you feel about this? Does it make you feel a bit miserable? British people, we like to always feel like there's if you are indeed British, of course, but in this country, we do like to feel like there is an escape hatch somewhere in any conversation. And we tend to use humor for that. Like, is there a way that we can just bring this down a peg because it's getting a bit heavy? So somebody will say a joke or they'll make a jokey comment. And that's natural. Roll with that, I think. I think that is a natural way that we tend to manage difficult situations. But I think broach it. Open it up, see what their action's like, and then you can gradually start to build up to the bigger things, and like around autism, for example, you might not want to, for very good reason, want to say, oh, I'm autistic, but you could at least get the conversation open. You heard a lot about autism recently. I was reading a really good book, maybe one of mine, or any of the millions of great books about autism that exist out there. I was reading this really good book the other day about autism, and it really got me thinking, all those kids at school, when we were at school, who might have been autistic and never knew it, and how that must have been really difficult. And, if you keep it light, keep it open, keep it curious, people might feel quite comfortable to start talking about it, and then you can take it from there and judge it as you go. But do try, definitely try, because like I said, I think you might find that they might be just as desperate to talk about it as you are.
Gradualization is a word I'll take away from this podcast today. It's not one I suppose it's the same with asking for accommodations at work. It's starting small, like adopting that door wedge approach of asking for very basic adjustments to start with, or in this case, talk about emotions very subtly and to almost then gauge the feedback, collect that evidence that is not going to be met with any judgment. And a lot of the time you'll notice that it's actually met with appreciation, and that removes the shame and allows you to then ask for more and gradually increase the conversation.
I think so. And it's possible that somebody hearing that might be like, well, no, because, why should I have to do that? I should be able to just, tell them everything they need to know. And I can empathize with that entirely. But what I would suggest is that actually it also helps with RSD if you do it that way, for your own benefit. Because if you start small and build up, if you know that you're going to build up, you're not just starting small because you're putting off the inevitable. You're starting small as a kind of strategy on your part, very autonomous. You've made this decision, you're going to start small, build up. That helps your RSD because you are, quite frankly, less likely to be refused. And that will help you enormously in terms of your mental health, your feeling of being welcome in the workplace or in the friendship group. I only say that because I know that some people will respond to that by saying, well, why should we? Why should we have to cater to neurotypical people? Because damn right. Why should we? We've been doing that all our lives. Surely we can now actually ask for what we need. And I totally get that. But sometimes it's about being careful and tactical, to make sure that you actually get the best for yourself. So I would agree. Yeah. Gradualization. Take it gentle.
Very helpful. Thank you so much, Pete. On behalf of our anonymous listener, just finally, I want to deliver you a letter that was written by the previous guest where they wrote their 3 rules to live by. I'll deliver that to you, Pete. If you could kindly read it out.
I can. Right. 3 rules to live by. Now I've got to try and read handwriting. I haven't done that for a few years. Find something you love and enjoy and gives you purpose in life, preferably something you can do for work. Well, I mean, that's nice if you can monetize it for sure. Don't underestimate yourself. Oh, that's my hobby, though. That is my hobby. You have so much more than you realize. And finally, take a proactive, lifelong approach to your physical and mental health. Well, I can't argue with any of those. You know, there's wisdom there. Who was that?
That was Judith Mooring.
Oh, nice.
Who was in yesterday, actually.
Oh, right.
Doing a conversation on how the menopause can complicate the ADHD experience.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Really important thing. Oh, that's lovely. Yes, yeah. So do I have to do one for the next?
Yes, please, at the end. That'd be very much appreciated.
I will. Do I get to keep this?
You can do, yes.
Ooh,
yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah.
It's just, nice thing to have, isn't it? Thank you.
Thank you so much on behalf of all of the viewers and the listeners. It's been genuinely insightful. Thank you so much, Pete.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me.